Hello everyone and welcome to the class of Principles of Microeconomics, Econ 111. This is lecture number 15 and in this lecture we are going to study about the government policies, supply and demand. So our learning objectives in these lectures are that we are going to understand the price ceilings and the price floors, and we are going to study the examples of the price ceiling and price floor. Then we will see that how the price ceiling and price floor will affect the market outcome, and by market outcome we mean that how much prices can fluctuate because of the price floors, and how will the quantity respond to the price ceilings and price floors. Then another policy that we are going to understand in this lecture is the taxes and how taxes affect the overall market, the equilibrium of the market, the prices and quantity that are determined in the market. Then we also need to understand what is the incidence of a tax. That is, how will it impact the consumers and how will it impact the producers, and what factors are responsible for the incidence, that why taxes can impact a producer more or a consumer more, in which cases such scenarios can happen. So we are going to study only those government policies that can alter or change the private market outcome. And these policies are generally known as price control. By price control, we mean that government decides how much price to be charged in a market. Instead, it is decided by the market itself. And normally we know that supply and demand will determine the prices, but if government wants to control the prices, if government wants to determine the prices, what will be the scenario? And that is called the price control. Then we have price ceiling, which is a legal maximum on the price of a good or service. For example, we have rent control. So in price ceiling, governments decide how much a maximum amount could be charged, and above that it will be illegal. Prices above a ceiling are illegal, but prices below a ceiling are legal. Price ceiling basically refers to the upper limit on the prices. Alternately, we have price floor, which is a legal minimum on the price of good or service. For example, minimum wage laws, that you will have to pay minimum salary to certain laborers for a given amount of work, and you can pay more than that, but you cannot not pay less than that. So basically a price floor is a lower limit. Price ceiling is the upper limit and price floor is the lower limit on a price. And then there is another policy that distorts the market equilibrium, that is taxes. And we will see that a government can make buyers or sellers pay a specific amount of tax on the transactions, and that amount of tax can modify the market price and the market quantity sold. So we'll see how the modification, how the changes occur, and who will be impacted more from this policy. Here is an example from the markets for apartment. As we said, that price ceiling is related to the upper limit, and we said that, for example, we apply a price ceiling on the rents. So rent is basically the price of a house for a certain amount of time, whereas here we have the quantity, and this quantity is basically the quantity of apartments available for rent and the quantity of apartments that are demanded for rent. And then we have the demand curve, which basically tells us that if the prices or the rent increases, then the demand for the apartments will decrease. And then we have the supply curve. If people are willing to pay higher rents, the rents in the market are high, then more and more people will be willing to rent out their apartments. But if the rent payment in certain area is low, then less and less owners of houses, they will not be willing to supply their houses for rent purposes. An equilibrium is determined where supply and demand meet each other, the point where the two intersect. And at that point, let us say that the rent is $800, whereas the quantity determined is 300 apartments. So this is our equilibrium. And now, after determining the equilibrium, we say that let the government impose certain restrictions, and that restriction is that you cannot charge prices above certain limit. So let's say the government impose a price ceiling of $1,000 and say that nobody can charge above 1,000. Now, this type of price ceiling, which does not affect the market, that is called non-binding price ceiling, because the market price is 800, and if the prices rise slightly above 800, there will be an excess supply of apartments and there will be low demand for these apartments. Therefore, it is not in the best interest of the suppliers to raise the price. And if the government has imposed a restriction that is $1,000, then we do not need to follow that because the market is already established at $800. Therefore, this type of price ceiling is called non-binding price ceiling because it has no effect on the market. A binding price ceiling, on the other hand, is the one which can affect the market prices. Let's say now the government decides to charge 500 to keep the rental rate at $500, whereas if left to the market, the rental value would have been $800. Now in this case, many suppliers, many homeowners will not rent out their apartments because they consider it unprofitable. And on the other hand, since the rate is too low, there will be many people demanding these apartments. Many people would wish to live in these apartments. So as a result, there will be a shortage in the market. And let me show you the shortage. Now, this type of ceiling is called binding constraint or binding price ceiling because it affects the market prices. Let's say the market demand at 500 is 400 units, whereas the supply of houses is 250 units. So there is a shortage equal to 150, that is 400 minus 250. So these much houses are in shortage. These are not available, whereas people want to live in these apartments. Then in the long run, the issue is more severe. Why? Because in the long run, we have elastic demand curve and elastic supply curve. and as a result, the demand for houses is 450, whereas the supply will be 150. Why is this? Why is this elasticity? Because in the short run, many house owners are not willing to rent out their property, but they cannot sell their property instantly. In the long run, they are able to get rid of the property because they consider it unprofitable. And in addition to that, the shortage will also add on. With the passage of time, more and more shortage will be created. Hence, in the long run, the shortage will be more as compared to the shortage in the short run. Then, when there is a shortage, it creates problems. The first problem is that the goods need to be rationed among the buyers, and a rationing mechanism usually leads to longer lines. If you look at, for instance, if you look at the petroleum products, usually the fuel prices are determined by the government, whereas they are not decided in the market. So when the government has a price restriction that is binding, whereas the actual price should have been high, the fuel becomes short in the market. As a result, you will see longer lines. For instance, in Pakistan, at certain time periods, the demand for natural gas is high, especially in the winters when the demand for natural gas is high. Its availability is low, but its price still remains the same as in the summers. This creates shortages, and due to the shortages, you will observe longer line to the CNG pumps. All right. So, what will the sellers do in this case? In many cases, you will also observe that the sellers will prefer paying CNG to the relatives or to the friends rather than to the general public. So this is a problem with the longer lines. So discrimination occurs. There is biases, and this creates inefficiencies in the economy. Therefore, government should leave such things to the market. Government should allow market to adjust the pricing mechanism. Then these mechanisms are often unfair and inefficient. As discussed, these are unfair because the allocation is unfair, and then inefficient because we still have shortages in them. If the prices were, let's say, not controlled, and the rationing mechanism was left to the market, then each and every person would get the commodity, because in that case supply equals to the demand. So let's do this with another example, and in this example we are going to study the price law. We have a market, whereas W here, it shows the price of a labor, and this is the number of workers or the labor hours that we consider in this market. So again, this is identical to the typical supply and demand. This is wage paid to unskilled workers, and this is the quantity of unskilled workers. Now, the demand curve for labor again is downward sloping. Why is demand curve for labor downward sloping? Because the more wage a worker demands, the more expensive he becomes to hire. So less and less labor will be hired if a wage rate is high, and more laborers will be in demand if wage rate is low. Then we have supply of laborers, that is the workers itself. The workers will be willing to work if you are paying them higher wages, but many workers will quit their jobs or their services when the wages are low. And again, we can have an equilibrium amount of wage, and equilibrium level of workers working in. So basically, in this example, we have equilibrium wage of $4 and 500 workers are currently working, and the economy is in equilibrium. But what if there is a minimum wage law? The government says that you will have to pay a wage of, let's say, $3 to each individual. At least you'll have to pay $3. You can pay higher, but you cannot pay less than $3. So this is basically a price floor. Now, this price floor is unbinding because it does not distort the equilibrium wage rate, that is 4. But let's say the wage rate decided by the government is 5, that you should pay at least $5 to each worker. So legally you are not able to pay $4. You will have to pay $5 or above. Now in this case, we have a binding price ceiling. See, the equilibrium wage rate is 4, and the market, the wage rate in the market is 5. So many workers will be willing to work on this wage rate, but firms will not demand these much amount of labor. Why? Because it becomes expensive for them to hire these workers. So there will be again a surplus amount of labor. The demand for labor will be 400, whereas the actual supply of labor, the workers, that will be 550. So there is a difference of 550 minus 400, that is 150 excess supply of labor. And in other words, you may say that there is an unemployment. The 150 laborers are unemployed. So basically what a price floor does in this case is that it creates unemployment in the economy. And economists argue that some of the reasons for unemployment in the economy is the minimum wage rate loss. And beside that, there are certain other theories that say the presence of the unemployment, that is uh, the efficiency wage. Efficiency wage means you pay extra for workers so that they can work efficiently. Unfortunately, that also creates unemployment, and there are certain other reasons as well, but those reasons are not the scope of this lecture. So the price floor in this scenario, that is binding. Why? Because it causes a surplus, and uh, it stops the market from achieving the equilibrium wage rate and the equilibrium quantity. Now, as I have discussed, that the minimum wage rate actually creates unemployment. So minimum wage laws do not affect highly skilled workers. Why? Because their demand is different from the demand of unskilled laborers. Basically, each class of laborers, maybe you say that with education, the demand for different types of workers changes. Uh, a master student or a graduate student lies in a different market as compared to an uneducated or ungraduated person. So we have different markets for different type of skilled workers. Some people may be engineers, but we cannot combine engineers with doctors. Engineers have their own market, doctors have their own market. So these laws do not affect the highly skilled workers. Okay, they do affect the teen workers. Some students, they are willing to do jobs. If you look at the European countries, people from the developing countries, especially the students, move there to find work as well as to study. So, because of high influx of students to those countries, the wage rate for students have declined. You can say that the unemployment rate for students has risen somehow. The studies say that a 10% increase in the minimum wage raises teen unemployment by 1 to 3%. Here are some examples for you to try as well. Uh, Here we have market for hotel rooms, and what you have to do is determine the effect of a price ceiling of 90 rupees. What will happen to the market? What will be the market price? The quantity demanded at that level, the quantity supplied at that level, where there will be any shortage or not. Then also, if let's say this 90 rupees were not a price ceiling but it was a price floor, then what will happen to the market in that case? And also try to attempt, if the price is 120, the price floor is 120, then in that situation what will be the market supply, the market demand, and whether in all of these three cases whether the price ceiling or price floor will be binding or not. So can you tell whether in question A, question B, or question number C, whether the price ceiling or the price floor is binding or not? And also discuss the quantities if you can. Okay, let us do that. If the price ceiling is 90, then is this a binding price ceiling? Yes, of course, this is a binding price ceiling. Why? Because the market price of 100 is not achievable in this case. The legal price cannot be more than 90, and 100 is more than 90, so we cannot achieve 90. And there will be a shortage because the quantity demanded at this stage will be 120 and the quantity supplied at this stage is 90. So there is a shortage of 30 apartments or 30 rooms. Now in the second part, if this is a price floor, will this be binding? No, this cannot be a binding price floor because according to the law you cannot go below 90, but you can charge above 90, and 100 is above 90. So this is a non-binding price floor. So in this situation, the market price will be 100 and the quantity supplied and demand will also be 100. In the third case, if the price is 120, the price floor. So now the price cannot be less than 120 and 100 is less than 120. So the actual price will remain at 120, and on 120 the quantity demand is 60 whereas the quantity supplied is 120. So there is an excess supply, and this excess supply is 120 minus 60 equals to 60. So 60 rooms will be vacant. Summarizing the price control policy, whether a price control policy is a good policy or a bad policy. So what we have learned here is that if we recall the 10 principles of economics, one of the principles was that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. And we now know why market is a good way to organize economic activity, because if government instead of the market tries to control the prices, it imposes a price ceiling or a price floor, maybe for very good intent. Let's say that the government, the prices are the signals that guide the allocation of society resources. It helps the society allocate the overall goods, that is the supply and demand, to such a level that is efficient. But if policy makers they choose to allocate it differently by changing the prices, what will happen? Let's say they want to help the poor and they impose the minimum wage law. As a result, what happens is that the prices will remain stuck at a certain level, and it will create unemployment. In similar cases, when we talk about the rental control program, if governments decide how much rent to be charged in a specific area, As a result, what will happen? The houses availability will be a problem. There will be no houses for rent, so there will be a shortage in the market. And therefore, we should allow the market to allocate the resources. Instead, we uh, blame the government and ask them to control the prices. Usually, it happens when there is a high level of inflation. In most cases, the culprit is the high demand or the low supply, but we blame the government for that purpose and saying that they should impose a price restriction. Now, if the government impose a price restriction, the result will be shortages or inefficient allocation of resources.